Percents, Part 1. In today's lesson, students will understand that a percentage is part of 100, and they'll be able to change from decimals to percents. They'll be able to change decimals into what? Very good. Today we'll be learning about percents. Who's heard the word percent before? Anybody? Yeah. You deal with percents in real life all the time, like in school, right? When you take a test, you say, oh, what percentage did you get correct, right? When you get your grades, grades are often in the form of percents. What's the best grade you could have? You could have 100%, which means you have everything right, okay? So a percent, it's important to know that it is part of 100. A percent is part of what number? 100. And you know that a percent, okay, if it's out of 100, that's really just a fraction, all right? So we're going to write a percent is equal to a fraction. Okay. That has what number as the denominator? It's out of what? 100. It has 100 as the denominator. Okay, so let's take a look at this fraction. And it says, read it with me, it says 70 hundredths. 70 hundredths. Okay, so 70 hundredths. The way that we work with percents is we start with a fraction. We understand that a percent, okay, is part of 100. It's part of a whole, just like a fraction. Then we're going to move from the fraction to the decimal. How would you write 70 hundredths as a decimal? Remember that the hundredths place is 2 places after the decimal. What is it? 2 places after the decimal. So for example, 70 hundredths we write as decimal 70. We say this as 70 hundredths or 0.70. Okay, now, just like decimal is another way to write a fraction, a percent is another way to write a decimal. So you can write it 3 ways. We have the fraction, the decimal. How do you change a decimal into a percent? Okay, to change a decimal into a percent. I'm actually going to say percentage. T-A-G-E. Okay? To change a decimal into a percentage. Now, the way that you really do it is by multiplying it by 100. Multiplying it by 100. Okay? So, here's the long version. If I took 100, I multiplied it by 0.70. Okay? I'll show you the shortcut. Watch this. If you take 70 and you multiply it by 100, that's going to be 7 with how many zeros? How many zeros are in this problem? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, when you multiply with decimals, you see there's 2 places after the decimal, so the decimal starts here. I'm going to move back 1, 2, and the answer would be 70%. But there's an easier way to do that. Okay, I'm going to show you the shortcut so you don't have to multiply by 100. So to change a decimal into a percent, here is the decimal. You're going to move it to the right 2 places. 2 places, watch. Move the, now you're going to write decimal 2 places to the, what direction is this? To the right. Boom. Okay, so watch what I do. If I want to change this into a percent, I say, I'm going to move this over to the right. 1, 2. Now the decimal is here, and it kind of becomes invisible. And so the answer would be 70%. Okay. Again, if you want to change a fraction to a decimal to a percent, you can even look at the original fraction and tell me now, what is the numerator? Is it 70? Yes. Is 70 out of 100 the same as 70%? Yes. So another shortcut is saying, well, what's the numerator of the fraction? Let me just put a percentage at the end of that number. Okay? So very simple. Go ahead and get that down. So now let's practice changing fractions to decimals to a percent. In the first example, we have this fraction. What do you call the fraction? It's called what? 30. Not called 30 over 100. It's called 30 hundredths. 30 hundredths. Okay, good. So how would we change this to a decimal? How would we change it to a decimal? Well, we know that you start with a decimal, and you can actually just write, if it's already in hundredths, you can actually just write 30. Because if you wrote decimal 30, the 0 would be 2 places after the decimal, which is the hundredths place. So there's your decimal. How then do you change the decimal into a percent? What do you do to change the decimal into a percent? Remember what you do? You have to move the decimal, right? How many places over? Say 2 places to the right. Repeat after me. Say 2 places to the right. So here's a decimal, okay? You would move it 1, 2. And then you would end up with 30. There's really an invisible decimal here, okay? And then it would be percent, okay? 30 becomes a whole number, and the decimal comes after the whole number. If you got 30 out of 100 correct on your test, you would get a 30%. Does anyone know what that is? Oh, that's really low, okay? Yeah, if you get half right, it's an F, so this is a really low F. None of you would get that. But yeah, this would be 30%, 30 out of 100, or 30 hundredths. Write that down. So now what would happen if you were given the decimal 0.75? Okay, 0.75. What do you call this decimal? Remember, 2 places after the decimal is called the hundredths place. So if you're really talking about 0.75, remember this is 75 cents. You could either say, how many quarters is that? 75 cents? 3 quarters, or 75 what? 75 hundredths. Okay, so I say 75 hundredths, and what fraction do you visualize? What fraction is this actually? 75 out of what? Yes, it is 75 hundredths, so you say 75 over 100. 75 out of 100, right, is 75 cents, or 3 quarters. How would you change this decimal into a percent? What do you do with a decimal? What do you do with it? You move it where? To the right. How many places? 2. When you move it 2 places, you're actually multiplying by 100 to make this a whole number. Okay, to make it a whole number. So if you took the decimal away, it would be what? 75. The way that I do that is by moving the decimal place over 2 places to the right. And then I just write either the numerator or the whole number, 75. And I say 75%. For example, I say 3 quarters is 75% of $1. See, there's another way of saying that. Yeah. I got a 75%, 75 over 100, on my math test, which means I got a what? What grade is 75%? It's a C plus. Not bad. You could do better, but not bad. Okay, go ahead and get this down. Let's try this example. Read the fraction with me. It says 5 hundredths. 5 hundredths. How would you write 5 hundredths as a decimal? Okay, now let me ask you, If I say 5/100ths, which place after the decimal am I talking about? The first place after the decimal or the second place? Hundredths, hundredths, 2 places after the decimal. So then fine, I would write a 5 right here, okay, 5/100ths, but what goes here? What goes here? Oh yes, a 0, right? The 0 would have to be the placeholder. So these are tricky when you're given single digits and, like ones, okay? You have to actually write this as decimal 0.5. That's what's really tricky about this, okay? This says 5/100ths. Now, would you write 0.5% right here? What do you think you would write? Here's the trick. Look at the numerator, put a percentage after it. That's how you find percent. So I would say 5%, wouldn't I? 5%. How would I do it? By moving the decimal over 2 places to the right. Look what happens. I'm going to move it 2 places. 1, 2. And here's a decimal now. Now I have 5, little decimal here, percent. 5%. And this decimal, there's really an invisible decimal after every whole number, right? After every whole number. Let me tell you this. If you talk about $1, $1. Don't you write $1 like this? 1.00. Isn't that how $1 is written? Okay. But you talk about $1, and can you also write it like this? $1. Yes. So you either, whenever you have a whole number, there is an invisible decimal there, okay? But you do not need it when you write percent. Now let's see if you were really listening. What if I give you 2% and I say, tell me what that is as a fraction and a decimal, okay? Now what are you going to do? 2%. 2%. Well, the easiest thing to do is remember, oh, okay, Ms. Cotran told me that a percentage is a fraction that has a denominator of what? A percent always has a denominator with the number 100. Okay. I also told you that this number, this whole number 2, is the numerator of that fraction. So what would the fraction be? Anybody know? What would the fraction be? Okay. All right. It would be 2 as the numerator over percentages always have a denominator of 100. This is 2/100ths. 2/100ths. Good. 2% is actually 2/100ths. But how do you write that as a decimal? Do you write it as this? Is that 2%? Is that 2/100ths? Yes or no? No? Why not? Because this is in the which place? Tenths place. So this is really 2/10ths. That's completely different. This actually says 2/10ths or 20/100ths. So how do you make it say 2/100ths? Okay, well 2 has to be in the hundredths place. So what do you put in the tenths place? A 0. Very good. Okay, as a placeholder. So you're going to write it as decimal 02. Okay, that is 2% or 2/100ths. Go ahead and get that down.